In the summer of 1944, an American paratrooper descending over Normandy carried no kitchen, no stove, no supply line. Strapped to his body alongside 60 kilograms of weapons, ammunition, and equipment was a small cardboard box containing everything he would eat for the next 24 hours. A few crackers, a tin of processed meat, a stick of chewing gum, and a chocolate bar engineered to survive the heat of a North African desert. Within minutes of landing, he would be behind enemy lines. He cut off from every support structure the modern military had built. His survival depended on his rifle, his training, and the contents of the box. Across every front of the Second World War, from the frozen outskirts of Stalingrad to the suffocating jungles of Burma, the question of what soldiers ate was never secondary to the question of how they fought. Armies moved on their stomachs. They always had. But this was the first war fought across every climate zone on Earth. The first war in which tens of millions of men had to be fed simultaneously across supply chains stretching 12,000 miles, and the first war in which the science of food preservation became as strategically vital as the production of tanks and aircraft. What emerged was a collection of field rations, 7 in particular, that did not merely keep soldiers alive, they reshaped the entire future of how humanity eats. The most iconic was the C-ration. It was the standard American field meal that fed millions of troops from North Africa to Okinawa. Introduced in 1938 and mass-produced throughout the war, the C-ration was built around a single technology that had existed since the early 19th century: canning. The principle originated with Nicolas Appert, a French confectioner who discovered during the Napoleonic Wars that food sealed in airtight glass containers and heated would resist spoilage for months, though he never understood why. The science came decades later, when Louis Pasteur's work on microbiology revealed that heat destroyed the bacteria responsible for decomposition. By the 1940s, that principle had been industrialized on a scale Appert could never have imagined. A complete C-ration consisted of 6 small tin cans, 3 containing a wet main course such as meat and beans, meat stew, or frankfurters and beans, and 3 containing an accessory pack of hardtack biscuits, a powdered beverage, sugar tablets, and cigarettes. Each set provided roughly 3,000 calories, enough to sustain a soldier through a full day of moderate combat activity. By 1944, American factories were producing over 1 billion cans of food per year for the military alone. The logistical demands were staggering. A single armored division of 15,000 men consumed approximately 35 tons of rations per day, nearly all of it sealed in metal. The metal itself became a strategic choke point. Its tin was sourced primarily from Bolivia, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, territories threatened or occupied by Japanese forces early in the war. The resulting shortage forced the rapid development of tin-free steel alloys and alternative coatings, while the War Production Board restricted civilian tin use so aggressively that American housewives organized nationwide collection drives, gathering used cans by the millions to be recycled into military containers. But canning had serious limitations that no amount of industrial scaling could resolve. The cans were heavy. A single day's worth of C-rations weighed nearly 2.5 kilograms, and for soldiers on foot, already carrying ammunition, weapons, water, entrenching tools, and personal equipment totaling up to 30 kilograms. Every additional gram mattered. The taste was almost universally despised. Soldiers described the meat component as a gelatinous, gray-brown mass that bore no resemblance to any recognizable cut of animal. The monotony was psychologically crushing. Field surveys conducted across multiple theaters revealed that troops eating C-rations exclusively for more than 3 consecutive weeks showed measurable declines in morale and combat effectiveness. Not from malnutrition, but from the relentless sameness of every meal. Men began skipping meals entirely, rather than open another identical tin. Military nutritionists documented what they called menu fatigue, a condition in which the body physically needed food, but the mind refused to cooperate. Soldiers would lose weight, grow irritable, and show impaired decision-making, all while surrounded by edible rations they simply could not bring themselves to eat. But in the calculus of industrial war, preservation and caloric density outweighed every other consideration. Food became fuel, nothing more. and the K-ration was designed to solve the problems the C-ration could not. Developed by physiologist Ansel Keys at the University of Minnesota, it was conceived specifically for mobile troops, paratroopers, scouts, rangers, and advanced infantry, who operated far ahead of supply lines and could not afford the weight of canned goods. The K-ration came in 3 small wax-coated cardboard boxes labeled breakfast, dinner, and supper, each compact enough to fit in a cargo pocket. The contents were a masterwork of multi-method preservation, compressed into minimal space. Breakfast contained a small tin of veal loaf, or chopped ham and eggs, a compressed fruit bar, 4 biscuits, instant coffee, sugar, and cigarettes. Dinner offered processed cheese sealed in tinfoil, more biscuits, a powdered drink mix, a granulated sugar packet, and hard candy. Supper provided a small can of potted meat or cervelate sausage, biscuits, bouillon powder, a confection bar, and chewing gum. The entire day's supply weighed less than 1 kilogram and delivered approximately 2,800 calories. Over 105 million K-rations were produced during the war, each one a small engineering triumph of weight, shelf life, and nutritional density. Keys himself later admitted that the ration was designed strictly for short-term emergency use, 3 to 5 days at most, bridging the gap until proper supply lines could be established. Yet the military ignored this caveat entirely. Frontline troops in the Italian campaign and across northwestern Europe subsisted on K-rations for weeks, sometimes months on end. The consequences were predictable: widespread vitamin deficiencies, chronic weight loss among infantry soldiers, and a psychological condition medics informally called ration fatigue, a total aversion to eating driven by the unbearable monotony of consuming the same flavors, textures, and smells at every meal for weeks without interruption. The body screamed for food. The mind shut down. The D-ration bar was never intended to be a meal at all. It was designed as a last resort, a concentrated emergency block of calories that a soldier could carry in his breast pocket and consume only when every other food source had failed. Developed in collaboration with the Hershey Chocolate Company, the D-bar was deliberately engineered to be unpleasant to eat. The military's specifications were explicit and unusual. The bar must weigh 4 ounces, deliver 600 calories, withstand temperatures up to 50 degrees Celsius without melting, and taste only a little better than a boiled potato. The reasoning behind this deliberate unpleasantness was strategic. If the emergency chocolate tasted good, soldiers would inevitably eat it as a casual snack rather than saving it for the genuine crisis it was designed for. Hershey's solution was a dense blend of chocolate liquor, sugar, cocoa butter, oat flour, skim milk powder, and artificial flavoring, mixed at such low temperatures that the cocoa butter never achieved the smooth crystalline structure that gives normal chocolate its snap and melt. The result was a bar so hard that soldiers could barely bite through it. Many resorted to shaving it with their combat knives or dissolving small pieces in hot canteen water to produce a crude cocoa drink. And over 3 billion D-bars and their successor, the tropical bar, reformulated with even higher heat resistance, were produced between 1940 and 1945. Soldiers universally hated them. But in the jungles of Guadalcanal, in the mountains of Tunisia, in the sodden hedgerows of Normandy, that ugly brown block was sometimes the only barrier between a conscious soldier and a collapsed one. When you have not eaten for 36 hours, you do not care about flavor. Calories are calories. The body takes what it can get. Spam, the canned pre-cooked pork product manufactured by Hormel Foods, became the war's most ubiquitous and culturally enduring ration. Unlike the purpose-built military meals designed in government laboratories, Spam was a commercial product adapted for wartime use, and its genius lay in its brutal simplicity. The ingredients were minimal: pork, shoulder, ham, salt, water, sugar, and sodium nitrite as a preservative. The mixture was ground fine and pressed into a distinctive rectangular tin and cooked inside the sealed can itself, producing a sterile internal environment that could last for years without refrigeration. The result was a uniform pink block of meat that could be sliced, fried, boiled, diced into stew, mashed onto biscuits, or eaten cold straight from the container. Over 150 million pounds of Spam were shipped to Allied forces during the war, making it one of the most widely distributed food products in human history up to that point. American soldiers coined dozens of derisive nicknames: mystery meat, meatloaf without basic training, the ham that didn't pass its physical. But they ate it because the alternative was often nothing at all. The product's significance extended far beyond American forces. Lend-Lease shipments delivered enormous quantities to the Soviet Union, and where it supplemented a Red Army diet that was frequently on the edge of starvation. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev later stated bluntly that without American Spam, feeding the Soviet military during its most desperate years would have been untenable. After the war ended, Spam entered the permanent food culture of nearly every nation the conflict had touched. In Hawaii, where the product had arrived alongside the massive military buildup at Pearl Harbor, it became an essential ingredient in local cuisine and remains so today. The state consumes more Spam per capita than anywhere else in the world. In South Korea, budae-jjigae, army-based stew, was invented from Spam and other surplus American rations scavenged from military bases during the Korean War, and it persists as a beloved national dish. A wartime stopgap became a permanent cultural fixture across the entire Pacific Basin. On the Eastern Front, where supply lines were longer, more fragile, and more frequently severed than in any other theater, Soviet soldiers survived on rations that would have been considered starvation and fare by any Western standard. The foundation was sukhari, twice-baked black bread, dried to such extreme hardness that it could endure weeks of rough transport in canvas sacks without crumbling, and could resist mold growth even in damp conditions that would destroy ordinary bread within days. A Soviet infantryman's official daily ration in 1942 included 800 grams of bread, or its equivalent in sukhari, supplemented by small quantities of grain, meat or fish, animal fat, sugar, salt, and tobacco when the supply chain functioned. In practice, the full ration was rarely delivered. Quartermasters prioritized units in active offensive operations, which meant that troops holding defensive positions or in reserve frequently received half rations or less. At Stalingrad, the situation deteriorated beyond anything the ration system was designed to handle. Soldiers received a few hundred grams of sukhari per day and a thin broth of buckwheat kasha with scraps of whatever protein could be found, horse meat from animals killed by shelling, occasionally tinned fish, sometimes nothing at all. They supplemented with frozen potatoes dug from the cellars of ruined farmhouses, sunflower seeds scavenged from destroyed granaries, and whatever could be bartered from civilians who had almost nothing themselves. Soviet medical records from the winter of 1942 to 1943 document tens of thousands of cases of alimentary dystrophy, clinical starvation, among frontline troops who were still expected to fight. Muscles wasted, wounds healed slowly or not at all. Men collapsed under the weight of their own equipment, and still, somehow, they held. German field rations reflected a military machine that had planned for rapid, decisive campaigns and found itself trapped in a grinding war of attrition it was never logistically prepared to sustain. The standard Wehrmacht combat ration centered on Kommissbrot, a dense rye wheat bread that could last up to a week in moderate conditions, supplemented by hard sausage, tinned butter or lard, processed cheese, and Dauerbrot, a specially formulated bread baked at very low moisture content and treated with calcium propionate and other preservatives to extend its shelf life to several months even in variable field conditions. It was heavy, dry, and so dense that soldiers sometimes described it as eating compressed sawdust. But it survived heat, cold, and rough handling that would reduce ordinary bread to crumbs. The most distinctive element of the German field diet was Schoka-Cola, a caffeinated dark chocolate disc produced by Hildebrand in Berlin. Each circular red tin contains 16 individually scored triangular pieces packed tightly together, delivering roughly 500 calories and a caffeine dose equivalent to approximately 2.5 cups of strong coffee, derived from both coffee bean extract and ground cola nut. It was originally developed for athletes in the 1936 Berlin Olympics and rapidly adopted by the military as a dual-purpose supplement, a preservation problem and a performance problem solved in a single small tin. Coca-Cola was issued primarily to Luftwaffe pilots, U-boat crews, frontline assault infantry, and tank operators who required sustained alertness during extended operations. But as the war ground on and Germany's logistical capacity collapsed under Allied bombing and territorial losses, rations shrank in both quantity and quality with alarming speed. By late 1944, Wehrmacht troops on the Western Front frequently received less than half their authorized daily caloric intake. On the Eastern Front, the situation was catastrophic. At Stalingrad, encircled German troops of the Sixth Army were reduced to slaughtering their remaining horses, then their guard dogs, and finally scraping the last traces of fat from leather equipment belts. The Luftwaffe's aerial resupply into the pocket delivered, on its best day, roughly 105 tons, against a calculated minimum daily requirement of 550 tons. When there is nothing left to preserve, preservation technology becomes irrelevant. Japanese field rations were built around a fundamentally different culinary philosophy and a set of logistical assumptions that proved fatally optimistic. The core was always rice, polished white rice carried in individual cloth sacks or prepared in battalion field kitchens using portable charcoal stoves. Japanese military doctrine viewed rice not merely as nutrition, but as a psychological anchor, a connection to home that sustained morale in a way that no Western equivalent could replicate. The rice was supplemented by umeboshi, intensely salted pickled plums whose extreme salinity and acidity created a chemical environment hostile to bacterial growth, allowing them to survive for months without refrigeration even in tropical heat. Soldiers also carried katsuobushi, blocks of bonito fish that had been repeatedly smoked, dried, and fermented over a period of several months until they achieved a hardness comparable to wood. The blocks had to be shaved with a small hand plane before being dissolved in boiling water to create dashi broth, a simple but nutrient-dense liquid that provided protein, minerals, and warmth. Dried seaweed, small bottles of soy sauce, pickled vegetables, and occasionally tinned crab or sardines completed the standard field diet. The Japanese military planning staff assumed that soldiers would supplement their official rations through local foraging, fishing, and requisitioning food from occupied territories, an assumption that held during the early conquests of Southeast Asia but collapsed catastrophically as the war turned against them. On island after island across the Pacific, Japanese garrisons found themselves cut off from resupply by American naval and air superiority. On Guadalcanal, the Imperial Navy's inability to maintain supply runs meant that Japanese troops were reduced to eating grass, bark, coconut husks, insects, and in documented cases, boiled leather from their own equipment. Japanese medical officers estimated that, of the approximately 23,000 Japanese soldiers who died on Guadalcanal, more than 15,000 perished from starvation and tropical disease rather than American fire. The rations they had carried were designed for short, victorious campaigns. The war delivered years of siege. What emerged from this vast, desperate, and multinational effort to feed armies across the globe was not merely a set of wartime solutions that ended with the peace. The preservation technologies refined under the specific pressure of military demand. Industrial-scale canning, spray drying, vacuum sealing, chemical stabilization, engineered melting points, calorie-dense emergency formulations, flowed directly and permanently into the civilian food industry in the decades that followed. Instant coffee, perfected for field use, and became one of the most consumed beverages on Earth. Processed cheese, once sealed in tinfoil for paratroopers, became a supermarket staple on every continent. Powdered milk, dehydrated soups, canned vegetables, shelf-stable meat products, all bore the unmistakable fingerprints of technologies developed not to delight consumers, but to keep soldiers from starving. The very concept of convenience food was, in large part, a direct inheritance from the logistical demands of feeding men who could not stop fighting long enough to cook a proper meal. The deeper legacy is more ambiguous. The war proved, at unprecedented scale, that food could be separated from geography, from season, from time itself. It could be manufactured in one hemisphere, sealed against biological decay, shipped across two oceans, stored for months in hostile climates, and consumed on the far side of the world with its caloric value intact. Nay, we gained the ability to feed vast populations across impossible distances, to decouple nourishment from the ancient constraints of harvest and proximity. We lost something harder to name, the intimate local relationship between a community and what it ate, the connection between the plate and the soil that had shaped human culture for 10,000 years. A farmer in Bavaria and a fisherman in Okinawa once ate differently because the world demanded it. After the war, they could eat the same canned meat from the same factory on the same day. Whether that represents liberation or loss depends entirely on where you stand. The trade-off, like most things born from desperate necessity, was simply irreversible. The soldiers who pried open those tins and tore into those wax-coated cardboard boxes and foxholes and trenches and jungle clearings across 6 continents were not thinking about the future of the global food system. They were thinking about the next hour. That the next patrol, the next morning, they might not survive to see. But every C ration opened in a hedgerow, every K ration eaten behind a stone wall in Italy, every D bar shaved into a canteen cup on a Pacific atoll, every spoonful of Spam fried over a camp stove in Belgium, every piece of sukari softened in thin broth on the frozen steppe was a small, unglamorous fragment of a transformation that would outlast the war itself. The science of keeping armies fed became the architecture of the modern food system, a system that nourishes 8 billion people today, often using methods that would be immediately